Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Feday Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Feday Chat at feday.email. Technology without compromise.
Well, after yesterday's news that the Pope had decided to signal to the entire church that he was going to keep all of Francis's men in place except 30 or 31 of the 32 men, and then promote a woman to have the ability to order around bishops and priests, we now return to our normal news. Normal being that, meaning there's nothing really normal going on in the church anymore and hasn't been for some time. And for the record, by the way, I get this question a lot. I do report good news when there is good news to report. And I don't mean parish bake sales and that kind of thing, but like legitimately like big news that's good. It just doesn't happen very often. But there is a crisis going on in the church, and a question I sometimes get asked is, well, what mass should I go to? I will never tell you which mass to go to. That is not my job nor the job of any other commentator. It simply is not. This is a decision you need to come to yourself through educating yourself about where the new mass comes from, the antiquity of the traditional mass, the kind of the barriers for attending mass with the Eastern rites for a Roman Catholic as opposed to a I don't know, Byzantine Catholic or something, right? But there's a lot of things that go into that question. However, I do sometimes get asked another question here. And how do I know if my new mass that I attend is valid or not? I am not one who says the new mass is not valid. I used to go to the new mass. But my family and I extend the traditional mass exclusively. I do not believe the new mass to be invalid. I believe it is valid. There are other concerns there besides the validity. However, I do not believe that every new mass offered is valid, because for the Eucharist to be confected, one of the things the priest has to do is to intend to do what the church does at the altar when he offers the sacrifice of the mass. And he also has to generally follow the rules for the mass and not ad-lib it and wing it and turn it into something else entirely. And to intend to do what the church does, he has to understand what the church does when he is at the altar. Very basic stuff, but the kind of thing you don't hear too often spoken about. Now, as an aside, if you like content like this Catholic news told without really sugarcoating things too much, hit the subscribe button. Could use you here. It does help keep the daily messages coming if you do that. Well, we have an example now in the news of the kind of mass that you can be sure is not valid. And I'll show you why. We got a story that comes from once Catholic Ireland, and yes, there appears to be a kind of a soft resurgence happening among young people there, like there kind of appears to be elsewhere. Though, again, we should be careful making claims that, Gen Z are becoming super trad and super Catholic, because the data is not really there that backs that up. There are indications that they are becoming more so than they were, but they still are attending church of any kind at rates less than millennials were, or maybe slightly elevated, like one church service extra a year or something than millennials were. Not exactly the most awe-inspiring statistics, but there are certain signs that there may be a revival happening. But Ireland is a canary in the coal mine for Catholics. And so we go here to LifeSite News. Headline: Irish priest equates receiving communion on the tongue with feeding animals. A Dublin cleric said in a homily that the purpose for Mass is sharing a meal and not worshiping God. So, if you only took what he said, receiving communion on the tongue is the same as feeding animals, you might respond with, well, our Lord said, feed my sheep, and we are to be sheep submissive to our shepherds. This is not what that priest means. Clearly, this is not what he means. And you get this because he does not believe the Mass is an act of worship, or it's not for worshiping God, but sharing a meal. This is for a synodal encounter, is what he means. It's man-centered and meant to elevate us in some way, as opposed to offer worship to God. This priest is a heretic. His own words condemn him. You can be sure that if you have a priest who says this stuff, that you should find a new parish. The bar there is fairly high, it sounds like, but really there are other metrics you can use, like heresy being taught from the ambo and other things. But this is one of those clear times where if you've got the ability to go to a different parish, you should, because his sacraments are dubious. They're doubtful, because he does not intend to do what the church does, which is with the Mass, any rite of the Mass, the church intends to offer fit worship to God through sacrifice. It's not a communal meal. Here are the details. Father Pat Fitzgerald, the interim administrator of Mount Argus Parish, compared during a recent homily the traditional reception of the Holy Eucharist at the altar rail and on the tongue with how wild animals are fed. During his homily, Fitzgerald touted that the church has progressed so far that the faithful no longer line up at the altar rail to receive Holy Communion, the same way as we feed animals. Just seconds earlier, the priest falsely proclaimed that the purpose of Mass is not to worship God, but to share a meal. How far we went from that. We had people lined up along on the altar rails, and we're feeding them the same way. And I don't mean any disrespect to people, but we have to say it. Feeding people the same way as we feed animals, the priest said. Bringing the Eucharist to them, putting it in their mouth the same way we would feed animals. Despite his derogatory remarks, the tradition of the Catholic Church for many centuries, unbroken until after the Second Vatican Council, is that the lay faithful receive the Blessed Sacrament, the literal body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, administered by a priest, his hands having been consecrated for the handling of the sacred Eucharist on the tongue while kneeling. I would only amend that, say that was the way of distributing Holy Communion in the Latin West. In the various rites of the East, there were different ways that all typically involved kneeling and on the tongue. Some traditions, totally valid fully Catholic traditions of the East, standing, but on the tongue, sometimes not by the priest by his hand, but sometimes, I don't know the official name of it, but in the Byzantine rite, they have a giant spoon thing. They put the bread and the wine in, and they give it to you that way. But there's always a symbolic, and maybe not so symbolic, but very literal act of submission by allowing you, by having you allow a priest to feed you in that way. This is not because it's a meal, it's because it's something else. In Memoriale Domini, the 1969 Vatican document, which Pope Paul VI granted bishops permission to distribute the Eucharist in the hand, the pontiff reaffirmed that the ancient practice of receiving Holy Communion on the tongue must be retained, especially because it expresses the faithful's reverence for the Eucharist. The Church explicitly stated again in Redemptionis Sacramentum that each of the faithful always has the right to receive Holy Communion on the tongue. Well, that changed, though, in practice in 2020, because the bishops first took our sacraments from us and closed our parishes. And then when they did reopen the churches, they basically forbade you to receive the Eucharist on the tongue. Indeed, in 2018, Cardinal Robert Serra, then prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, emphasized the widespread practice of receiving the Eucharist on the hand as part of Satan's diabolical attack on the sacrament. Why do we insist on receiving communion standing and on the hand? Serra pondered. The manner in which the Holy Eucharist is distributed and received, he wrote, is an important question on which the Church today must reflect. Furthermore, a recent study confirmed that traditional liturgical practice surrounding the Eucharist, including the manner in which he is received, increased belief in the real presence of our Lord in the Eucharist. To Fitzgerald's comparison, as noted by LifeSite News editor-in-chief John Henry Weston, of the faithful kneeling at the altar and receiving our Lord on the tongue to how animals are fed is a sign of humility and in line with our Lord's command that his sheep be fed. This is a priest who is not considered a schismatic by the authorities in the church. His loyalties, his orthodoxy is not being questioned by anyone with the power to actually question it. Meanwhile, if you're too traditional of a seminarian, you might get kicked out of your seminary. If you dare give a homily that is a little too spicy for the public consumption in this ultra soft age of indifferentism and lukewarmness, you might lose your posting, or at least get a dressing down from your priest on your first offense. But priests like that are in good standing. The next time somebody accuses you of being a schismatic, remember that. You have no duty to submit to errors of that kind coming from Rome. Speaking of what they tolerate, we live in an age when the faith is politicized. We live in an age when we are getting a good idea of what the authorities in Rome's priorities are. Good example of this is the SSPX debate right now. The Vatican issued the clearest document I've seen probably in a decade on anything going on in the church, with the least ambiguity in it, in trying to stomp out the SSPX and prevent them from consecrating bishops. That kind of clarity would be useful in virtually every document, but that's the clearest we've seen. There's another way to gain clarity on the state of the church today. One of those is priorities. What do they allow, and what do they try to suppress? That is our watchword right now. That is our keystone to understanding things going on. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that they allow before we get to what they suppressed, because they're getting very superstitious now in Rome. It's almost absurd how superstitious they are. But first, go to X, formerly called Twitter, posted by just a normal Catholic, right? This is video footage of a carnival mass in the church in Germany. I'll mute that for copyright reasons because it's music. And yes, sometimes music just sung in a church can trip over copyright. But you've got some actual clowns here. Literal clown mass. Literal clown mass. The German bishops are actually schismatic. At least not all of them. There's certainly a few who are trying to resist the German synodal heresy. But this is a good indicator of the state of the church today. That's just one example. This one zeroes in on the bishops because they are complicit in a grave crime being committed in the church right now, and that is essentially treating the church and its property as something to be looted. Michael Hitchmorn posted that there's a proposal to build a temple to the Saracens on an ancient abbey dedicated to Saint Columcille, and it calls it outright satanic. Yes, the bishops are now selling church property to avowed enemies of Jesus Christ. Ones that are places that have the bones of saints, their final earthly resting place. You know what the Saracens will do when they get their hands on that property. I don't need to spell it out for you. Any student of history knows what they'll do. We are assured by Vatican authorities they worship the same God as we do because they are monotheists. So that means they worship the same God that we do. And that's not true. We do not worship this. They do not worship the Father. They worship a paganized idea that has got ideas lifted from Judaism and Catholicism, and then wrapped up in language fit for those who are a people ruled by their passions. And that theology, if you want to call it that, then fans the flames of those passions. To say that we worship the same God is deeply insulting to our Lord, especially when you see what they've done to him in their own wicked theology. But that is what this is what they're up to. We have a story that is so absurd, and I've been following this for a couple of weeks, and I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so the other shoe has finally dropped, and we go to LifeSite News. For this remarkable headline, Diocese of Rome orders removal of angel image resembling Giorgia Meloni while Rupnik works remain. You know who Giorgia Meloni is? Well, that's Miss Meloni, the most important politician in Italy right now. She is right wing, which means she's not some, lunatic progressive. So what happened is there's an artist doing some sacred paintings, and one of the angels had a passing resemblance to Giorgia Meloni. Somebody let the bishops know, and they got lathered up. They got worked up into this lather, frothing at the mouth. Oh, this cannot stand. We have to take care of this. Meanwhile, Marco Rupnik's art still hangs in many parishes and cathedrals and church properties in Italy. They haven't been taken down, And you know what he's accused of. And if you don't, well, I can't say explicitly on YouTube. It'd be a blatant terms of service violation if I were to tell you as in the blunt language that I would like to. But I also can't bring myself to say what he did because it involves nuns and it implements that are sacred and reserved for the fit worship of God at the Eucharist and in the Holy Mass. And it was one of the most evil men in the church today. His name is synonymous with Maciel and Ted McCarrick. And his artwork still hangs in many parishes and cathedrals all around the Western world. That's to say nothing about the distasteful nature of his so-called sacred art. His works still hang up. The bishops hemmed and hawed about removing it. It makes you wonder why. When just coincidence that a politician that some Italians view as being like a big bad orange man himself, like Donald Trump, there's an angel that looks vaguely like her. So they had to spend resources to alter the painting because he wouldn't want to offend anyone. That despite the fact that Catholics from around the world have raised our voices repeatedly, signed petitions, contacted nuncios, petitioned Rome directly to remove Marco Rupnik's art. A couple of places responded positively, but mostly they've just ignored it. The Pope wanted to restore a little bit of faith that people have in the hierarchy. He could order a church-wide removal of Marco Rupnik's art pieces. Here are the details of this. The Vicariate of Rome ordered the removal of painted angel's face resembling Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in a Catholic church after public outcry. Meanwhile, a controversial 2017 mural in Terni featuring Archbishop Paglia without clothes, alongside other explicit elements, and many works of disgraced former Jesuit Marco Rupnik remain untouched. Paglia is Archbishop Paglia was he's a figure in the church that his positions are basically what, if you could imagine what it would be like to have Father James Martin FJ as a bishop. That's Archbishop Paglia, basically. And he had a painting of himself done where he wasn't wearing any clothes at all in the painting. And there were other real questionable James Martin type imagery in that artwork. It's still up in a parish. Yeah. On the 4th of February, the image resembling Meloni at the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Lucina in Rome was painted over, despite having previously been restored after the Vicariate of Rome, which operates within the Diocese of Rome, instructed the parish priest to ensure the restoration of the chapel's original features. Ecclesiastical authorities requested that the restoration of the original features of the face in the exclusive interest of safeguarding the place of worship and its spiritual function, having taken note that the work presented physiognomic traits not consistent with the original iconography in the sacred context. In other words, they made up a reason to remove the image. The decision followed public controversy over the angel's resemblance to the Italian politician and occurred while the special superintendents of Rome was conducting archival research to compare the restored image with the original decoration in preparation for a possible reinstatement. The repainting occurred before completion of the archiving project, apparently surprising state authorities. The Ministry of Culture later emphasized that any further work required formal authorization. In other words, what they did broke the law. They broke the law to do this because, dang it, we can't have a painting that looks vaguely like a prime minister whose politics we disagree with because she's right wing. Rome, ladies and gentlemen, the Vatican. These are the people running the church right now. The controversy had escalated in the days preceding the removal. Parish priest Father Daniele Micheletti had initially stated that he did not understand the uproar because the priest sounds sensible. However, his remarks were later publicly contradicted by Cardinal Vicar Baldo Reina in an official note. The note dated February 1st reads, quote, "The Cardinal Vicar of His Holiness, Baldo Reina, distances himself from the statements made by Father Micheletti and expresses his sorrow over what has happened. He will immediately initiate the necessary inquiries to verify any responsibilities of the parties involved. Renewing the commitment of the Diocese of Rome to safeguarding its artistic and spiritual heritage, it is firmly reiterated that images of sacred art and of the Christian tradition cannot be subject to improper uses or instrumentalization, as they are intended exclusively to support liturgical life and personal and communal prayer. After that intervention, the parish priest remained silent. The vicariate's prompt action was described as a demonstration of his usual zeal, particularly in comparison with its approach to other Italian cases involving sacred art. For example, Italian journalist Nico Spontoni contrasted the handling of San Lorenzo in China controversy with a continued public display of works by Marco Rupnik, dismissed from the Jesuit order after it judged accusations of impure kind and psychological abuse brought against him by several former nuns to be highly credible. End quote. That is putting it mildly. The modern Jesuits are nothing to applaud. They're not. They're one of the worst orders in the church at this time, to the point where people openly ask, why have they not been suppressed yet? Rupnik was a Jesuit, which will shock no one. His antics, his evil satanic deeds were too much for the Jesuits, and they expelled him from the order and then recommended the Pope recognize that he had been automatically excommunicated, because what he did was first found a order of women religious back in like the 70s or 80s. And then he used his authority over the women in that community to coerce them into impure acts that violated their vows. And then, and here's how he got excommunicated, he used his authority as a priest in the confessional to get them to confess the sins he coerced them into committing, and then absolved them of those sins in the confessional. And that's how he incurred his automatic excommunication. He weaponized the sacraments. That's how he got it. And then Pope Francis lifted his excommunication. And Rupnik wanders around free, still doing his stuff. People still order his artwork to be put in parishes and things. After that evil event came to light, after decades of the most evil things imaginable involving nuns, guess what? His artwork still hangs up. The bishops of Italy couldn't be bothered. They really didn't take it all that seriously, because that's not apparently as offensive. Rupnik isn't. And his continual reminder in parishes and cathedrals and other places, that is not as evil to them as a painting that was restored that looks vaguely like the current prime minister of Italy. Take all the time you need to wrap your head around this absurdity. These are the men running the church. These are the men that we are told to submit to. Otherwise, we are the schismatics. We want to see a sign that the ape of the church is utterly like wrapped in madness. This story is one of those. I'm very curious what you think about this. Do you find this as absurd as I do? This was a story that developed over the course of a few weeks, because there was always going to be the other shoe dropping, and it finally did. They rushed out to take care of this problem, and Marco Rupnik's art still hangs publicly, and people are deeply disturbed when they look at it, because his artwork has a lot of signs in it, in his style, that there's something deeply disordered in the man. I'm very curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you have not. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition, it does help keep the daily messages coming. There's that subscribe plus button, Patreon subscribe star, that kind of thing. Get access to a patron-only Discord server and the occasional extra stuff I give to channel supporters. Your support is greatly appreciated. Helps keep the daily messages coming. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.